Hello, folks. Rebecca Adams. I'm back with Becky Vermeer.
Hello. How
And
are you?
oh, fabulous. And yourself.
Oh, the same. Can't complain. Can't complain.
That's good. And Teddy's doing well, I hope.
He's MIA right now, so I'm hoping Teddy's doing well. He might join us later on. You never know.
I know, right? Yeah, just like mine. She's back here
Sawing
snoring.
some logs.
Yeah, snoring loudly. So I don't know if you'll hear that or not, but
Nope, I can't
anyway,
hear
that's good. Well,
it.
folks, we've got a really interesting program tonight. It's a follow-up on what we did when we recorded last week. And I believe the title I gave it was about opening your eyes to see abuse, like what abuse to look for, that kind of thing.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, that kind of a title. Sorry, that didn't help you any, did it? So uh, anyway, so this is a follow-up to that, and I think you're really going to be fascinated with this. I loved it when Becky sent this to me, and I started reading, and I thought, oh, this is perfect. So Becky's going to be reading some things to us and teaching us some stuff about, well, I'll just turn it over to you. What are you going to teach
Okay.
us about, Becky?
Well, at the conclusion of our conversation last week, something that you said struck a memory with me of when I very first started working at the Crisis Center. I stumbled on a chart, and it was called Biderman's Chart of Coercion. And I was fascinated by it when I saw it. And before I tell you exactly why I was fascinated with it, I'm going to define for you what it is, where this thing came from, and then we'll kind of go into how this kind of applies to domestic violence. So there's going to be a little bit of the reading because it's history and I don't want to misquote. I don't have it committed to memory. But around 1956, 1957, there's some conflicting dates. So I'm guessing maybe the end of 56 into the beginning of 57. That sounds fair. A gentleman by the name of Albert Biederman. He was a social scientist with the United States Air Force. He was assigned to research why many American prisoners of war captured by the communist forces during the Korean War were cooperating. Why are they cooperating with their captors? Nobody understood that. So after extensive interviews with the returned prisoners of war, Biederman concluded that there were three major elements behind the communist interrogators' coercive control: dependency, debility, and dread. So out of that, what he did is he created what he calls the chart of coercion. And in this chart, it lists 8 chronological general methods of torture that will psychologically break down an individual. So you've heard the expression brainwashing, I'm guessing. Another person that was kind of involved with this actually decided that the Chinese methods were called thought reform, which I think is a very interesting term. And so let me give you the psychological definition of brainwashing, and then we'll kind of talk about it a little bit. In the psychological dictionary, brainwashing is defined as that which manipulates and modifies a person's emotions, attitudes, and beliefs. It reduces a person's ability to mentally defend themselves and makes it easier for another person to control them. And so at the time, what the US Air Force decided was there's a reason why these prisoners are being so compliant with their captors. And it broke down to what Biederman said, this power and control differential that was going on. And so when I very first started working at the Crisis Center, I didn't have a lot of the educational resources at my fingertips that we now have, that you and I have referenced frequently, talking about our state coalition and the curriculums that they now have and that kind of thing. And so I made it my mission to educate myself. And it was by accident that I found this form, but this form was incredibly helpful to me trying to understand the dynamics of domestic violence. And so there's some words on there that I didn't even understand, didn't make sense. And so it caused me to want to dig into it more thoroughly. And so it's very interesting to me that the tactics that are used on prisoners of war are the same tactics that are used on victims of domestic violence. And we know you and I have talked multiple times on how a victim of domestic violence is held captive by an abuser, that escaping is really what it's going to take to get away from that abuser. People ask the question all the time, why does she stay? Why doesn't she try to leave? Or he's not physically abusing her. Why does he have this power over her? All of those things. And really, this chart really digs into that. And it's very eye-opening. And so my goal for tonight is I'd like for us to talk about it a little bit. How does that sound?
Absolutely. And I don't care if we take several episodes to really break it all down and chew on it.
Okay. There was another quote that I saw in here that I thought Biderman himself said when he was putting together this chart. He made this quote. Now remember, we're talking about communism was going on during the Korean War, and so they're focusing on how do the communists have this power over the Americans. Probably no other aspect of communism reveals more thoroughly its disrespect for truth and the individuals than its resort to these techniques. Did that make sense, or do you want me to read that again?
You can read it again, but that was good.
No other aspect of communism reveals more thoroughly its disrespect for truth and the individuals than its resort to these techniques. So there's no respect for truth. The things that they were saying, the things that they were doing are not truth-based. Right. And there's no respect for the people that they're doing them to. And so, we've heard a lot of things over the years. We talk about, I just lost my word as it popped into my head. We've talked a little bit, I think, about Stockholm Syndrome and how not only does the victim in that situation 100% rely on and trust the abuser, but we've heard love stories come out of Stockholm Syndrome, and they're not founded in truth. There's no respect for the truth there at all. It's the techniques that break the individual down that get them in this place. The other thing that I really want to point out before we talk about this, people always talk about domestic violence and they want to focus on the physical aspect of domestic violence. These techniques are not physical. This is 100% psychological warfare. Nobody was harmed in this video. It's 100% psychological warfare. And how powerful that can truly be. And so there was a point in time in the 50s where we realized how powerful it could be against war criminals, prisoners of war, I mean, but we didn't generalize it into our homes. Not in the 50s. We didn't want to talk about that then. But these techniques work in the same way.
Wow.
So, any questions about that? Comments, statements, anything you want to say?
It reminds me, it takes me back to when you were teaching us about the power and control wheel. And after we got done with that entire wheel, you said, notice there has not been anything physical here at all. Nothing. And that just, that's what it reminds me of. It's very stunning. It's very powerful.
Yeah. And so there will be some overlaps between talking about the power and control wheel and talking about this. But what I'd like to do just for fun, so I think these kind of things are fun. Actually, the report that I'm looking at and the copy that you have that's titled Biderman's Cartage Coercion, this was taken from Amnesty International's report on torture. Doesn't that sound like a good read?
Woo.
But again, they were focusing on prisoners of war and how prisoners of war really are tortured.
Which really puts it out there even more front and center that what all of us who have been through domestic violence have been through. It doesn't minimalize it. It brings it right out in the open and calls it what it truly is.
Right.
How powerful is that?
Yeah, so we're 100% talking about a psychological warfare.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, just to get off topic for a second, that people want to look at victims of domestic violence and we instantly say, well, they're crazy. They're out of their minds. If someone did that to me, I wouldn't stay in the relationship. Those are the things that people want to say. And so, our goal of educating people about the dynamics of domestic violence and the focus on power and control, this is just another comparative study of the same things that we've already said, but it looks at it in a little bit of a different way. So what I thought I would do since you have the chart and I have the chart, I thought what I would do is we would talk about each one of these 8 things. There's 8 things on this chart that are the coercive control exercises against the POWs. And so on one side of the chart, it talks specifically about how that looks if you're a prisoner of war. And on the other side of the chart, it talks about how that looks if you're in an abusive relationship. And so just for the fun of it, I was going to quiz you, but you have the chart in front of you, so that's not going to work necessarily the same way. But what I'd like to do is I'd like to read what the tactic is. I'd like to read what the purpose of that is. I'd maybe even talk a little bit about the variables that go on in that when you're a prisoner of war. And then I want you to hit the domestic violence side of it and talk a little bit about how you see that playing out in an abusive relationship.
Sure.
That sound like fun?
Yes, it does.
Okay. So, and I also have this really long article that I'm by no means going to read, but there are snippets in here that I think are interesting as well. And so before I jump into it, I want to read another quote from Amnesty International, also found in that report on torture. That title blows my mind.
Doesn't it?
Most people who brainwash use methods similar to those of prison guards who recognize that physical control is never easily accomplished without the cooperation of the prisoner. Think about that line.
Wow.
The most effective way to gain that cooperation is through subversive manipulation of the mind and the feelings of the victim, who then becomes a psychological as well as a physical prisoner. That's a mouthful.
Yes, it is.
So the only thing when I initially read that quote, and this is why I wanted to read it tonight, because the fact that it says is never easily accomplished without the cooperation of the prisoner went all over me when I read that. Because if we're talking about comparing this to a survivor of domestic violence, I can't stomach the thought that someone is suggesting that victims of domestic violence are cooperating with their abuser. But if we take that apart and look at that a little bit more reasonably than my initial gut punch reaction, when we went through the power and control wheel and we talked about the pieces of the pie that are not physical,
right?
One of the things that we highlighted was that threat of physical violence is hanging over the head of the victim all day, every day. And so in that respect, I can stomach that statement because if I know my abuser well enough, and I know that I can say up to a point these things, but if I say beyond those things, I'm going to be physically assaulted. What am I going to do? I'm not going to say those things.
Right.
And so in that respect, what I would call wisdom of the victim, Amnesty International in their report on terror would call cooperation.
Okay, yeah.
And so because of that, I can wrap my brain around it and I can agree with it. But I will tell you that my initial response was like,
right.
Now you've gone too far. Because I have a really hard time using the words that a victim cooperates with an abuser, because I don't think that's true. But I do feel like a victim in an abusive situation is going to exercise survival skills. And if in order to survive, this is what I do, I'm not cooperating.
Right.
I'm taking care of myself. And so then I can stomach it that way. What are your thoughts on that? Did you have the same reaction? I know you're writing a note down, so.
I am. Sometimes I'm writing a note down to remember to say something when it's, when it's appropriate. Other times it's notes about what I'm going to do when I post it. Like on
I thought maybe you're making a grocery list or something.
Oh, I'm so bored with what you're saying that. No. The one thing that I wrote down, for a while there, I was listening to survivors from the concentration camps. I spoke about that in the last episode. And I just found it. One thing I wanted to find out was, how did they survive? How? What was going through their minds? How did they stick it out and not just give up?
Right.
The one and only testimony that I heard. Did you ever watch Hogan's Heroes?
Yeah.
Okay. You remember the little short Corporal LeBeau?
Maybe.
Okay.
Yeah.
He was from France.
Oh yeah. Uh-huh.
Okay.
I know what you're
So
going to say, I bet.
he was actually a survivor from a
Oh, really?
concentration camp. And his story was the most inspiring out of all of them. I didn't hear anything from anybody else that remotely came close to what he shared. It was
Okay.
phenomenal. One thing that he did, he worked in a shoe factory for a while he was in the concentration camp.
Mhm.
It was so loud in there that the guards couldn't hear him. Well, he had been in entertainment before he was captured. So he sat there at his workstation and just sang at the top of his lungs every single fun song he could think of. And he just had a blast all day long. And I don't remember how many hours a day he worked, if it was 8, 10, 12 hours, I don't remember. And he just kept himself in that positive mode,
Mhm.
you know. I don't know that he ever thought about I am, or maybe I'm not going to get out of here, but he just stayed in this wonderful state of mind. And
Mhm.
I thought, okay, that's part of if I ever find myself in that situation, and I hope I don't, but that's one thing that I can do, because I tend to get too discouraged
Yeah.
and I lose all thought of
Yeah.
singing, of having music in my head, even, even if I'm not singing out loud. That was one thing
Right.
that really impressed me. And I will put that link in the show notes as well, so somebody can watch that if they want to. Right now, oh, Robert Clary, that was his name. Robert Clary. Yeah.
Okay.
So you could look that up.
Okay. And you just made me think, and I don't know any of the details around it. I just remember the story. And it was a story of a child, and it's not concentration camps, none of that. It's just a story
Mhm.
of a child in the hospital who had a sickness. I don't even remember the sickness, but the essence of the story was the child couldn't, maybe he was blind, I think, maybe he couldn't see out the window, maybe that's what it was. Anyway, I remember this in the story, the dad would sit next to the child's bedside all day long and look out the window and tell the child the things that were going on outside. And when the child recovered, I don't remember it well enough, but you just really, it's a memory somewhere in the back of my brain. When the child recovered and was able to stand up and look out the window, the view was a brick wall. It's an alleyway and a brick wall across the street. There
Oh,
was nothing outside. But that's one of the things, same kind of positivity that the father had done for the child, describing all of the beautiful things and motivating that child to fight to want to stay alive.
wow.
So you're right. I mean, attitude plays a big part in it. But I think about like during that time frame, have you ever read the book Playing for Time?
Mm-mm.
So with the way that you're fascinated by that era in history, you need to read that book
Okay.
because it focuses on, it's not a Christian book, it's just a story, a Holocaust story, but it
Mhm.
focuses on a group of people during that time um, that they were musicians.
Mhm.
And so when the SS found out that they had some of these musicians here, they were bringing them in. They got their own place where they were getting food, they were able to get clean, they were getting clothing, because then they were playing and entertaining the SS officers. And so the dynamic going on in there is some people felt terrible that they had so much and other people didn't have any, and then other people were like, I'm gonna, this is the way I survive, and just the mentality of the people there. But it's kind of that same kind of thing, is what do you do to survive
Yeah.
when you're in that situation?
Mhm.
And that's one of the ways they found to survive.
Wow.
Yeah,
The
you should read it.
the
They made I think they made a movie out of that book too. It's a pretty old story, so
the movie The Book Thief is another. I don't know if you've seen that movie, and I
uh,
understood that there's a book by that name.
I don't
Anyway,
know.
that one also, it would follow along the same basic lines of what
Yeah.
this and I don't want to give it away, but what this one person did to survive, because I didn't realize it till I saw the movie, but the Nazis literally made them bring all their books to the center of town, and they literally torched them all.
Huh. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Crazy.
Very interesting, because they knew that these books had things that would inspire them to think about freedom and, not being under control and all these sort of things, independent thinking. And of course we can't have that.
Right.
So that would be another one I would recommend too.
Yeah.
I'm going to have to look for that, Playing for Time.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure they made a movie out of it.
Okay.
Yeah. So anyway, let's talk about this chart a little bit. So the report on torture was actually written in 1973, so it's not current by any means. But the concepts in it, I think, are still accurate.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
So the number one method used during the war, prisoners of war, isolation. And so when you're talking prisoner of war, the effects or purposes, here's what they did using isolation. Deprive the victim of all social supports and of his ability to resist, develops an intense concern with self, makes the victim dependent upon the interrogator. The variants that go along with that would be complete solitary confinement, complete isolation, semi-isolation, or group isolation. So that every single one of those components had a purpose toward
Mm-hmm.
the isolation part of it. So deprives the victims of all social supports and his ability to resist, puts the victim in a place where they're hypersensitively concerned about themselves, but also realizing that they're dependent on the interrogator because they don't have anybody else. That's in a prisoner of war. So what do you think? How do you think that plays out in an abusive relationship?
Perfectly. It's a
Yeah,
perfect description.
yeah,
I can remember when we were planning our wedding, and already the whole isolation thing was beginning,
yeah,
and I didn't see it because I didn't know the red flags to look for.
yeah,
But he was making fun of friends and family and all these sort of things. Um, and that was his attempt, step number one, to try to break me away from everybody. And I fell right into it. And
right.
yeah, yeah. This one says, under domestic violence, it says denies participation in leisure activities. So cut off number one. We're not in prison yet, but we're working our way there.
Mhm.
Restricts contact with family and friends. Step number two. And that's one thing I said in my book, is that abusers absolutely love to do this. And the way I worded it was, they want you to be an island unto yourselves, just the two of you. And he's the only one that has any control over anything that goes on, any
Right,
and all activity, any and all time spent asleep or awake or whatever that would be. And you are literally cut off from everybody else because you're on that island just with him. You have
right,
no source of help at all. He is
right.
it, just like the interrogator.
Dependent on your interrogator. That's what you're talking about right there.
Yep,
Mm-hmm.
exactly. Excessive jealousy that reduces social interaction or discredits the victim to friends and family, which is what I just described that he
Right.
did. Yep.
And so let's even go back to the prisoner of war, where one of the variants is semi-isolation.
Yeah.
Well, maybe I'm going to try to uh, make this person my accomplice, so to
Mhm.
speak, or whatever else. So you're isolated from the group a little bit, but the tactic is purposefully isolating you from the group, but it's presented in a way as maybe there's a benefit to the isolation, but there's really not.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that plays out the same way in the home situation too.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
It does. Can, and also, we've talked about this before, but I'll just bring it up briefly. We had also discussed me staying home and raising any children that we might have.
Mm-hmm.
I was in agreement with that because that's what I wanted to do. That's all I had
Mm-hmm.
ever really wanted to do. It's one reason I didn't go to college. I saw no reason to utilize all that time and money when what I wanted to
Right.
do is stay at home and raise my kids. So he had that power and control over me, but I was also in agreement with that aspect of it.
Right.
So I want to clarify that.
Cooperating with your captor.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Controls or restricts use of transportation, phone, and or finances. And we talked about that in the last episode as well. That was something that became known to me after I left him, was how this is typical, to get him out in the middle of the country, rent some rundown house or whatever, no phone. And like you said, your gal, no air conditioning, no heat, and no electricity, nothing.
Right.
Had no way of getting in touch with anybody, no internet. And I was very controlled and restricted as far as the use of transportation, even though at a couple of points we had 2 vehicles. If there was by the time his payday was coming, because that was the only source of income, by the time his payday was coming, if I was almost out of gas, it was my fault, because I had gone too far. I had done too much traveling, and I was gallivanting around instead of just staying at home. So it was all on me. And if there was any breakdown of the vehicle, needed any repair, so it's still kind of focused back on me to a degree. My mom's situation was even more so like that. And I found your comment to that very interesting, because my stepdad would always say, "Oh, these women, every time they drive the car," and he would be laughing while he said it. Well, I didn't find anything funny with that. And you said, well, maybe he was the one who actually set up that situation, that when she drove it, that such and such, whatever part, was going to default,
Sure.
break down. And I had never thought about that.
I don't doubt that for a second.
It sure made me think, and I think you're dead on right. I really do. Yeah. I've said it before. I don't understand it. But I'm not supposed to understand it.
Right.
And then the last sentence says confines to the home. And boy, did I see that. I saw that with my mom, probably in a more extreme case. And I saw it with myself too, although I did have some freedom when he was working in the same city where we lived. As I told you before, he would stalk us, and I'd have the kids with me, and we'd be running errands, paying bills. And he'd say, well, so how was it at the library today? How did you know we went to the library today? Oh, I saw you. With that.
Which is creepy.
Oh, every time he did it, it gave me the creeps. The first time he did it, I didn't know. My mind went in a million directions all at once. I was appalled. I was creeped out. I was scared, which is exactly what he wanted.
Sure.
That we were being watched. I thought, how hideous that a husband would be stalking his own wife and children. Yeah, he knew how to do it well. Anyway, okay, I'm done.
So, and think about it, like any war movies I've ever seen. When I've seen war movies depicting this era, this time frame, and these specific groups of prisoners of war, and you see them thrown in like a hole in the ground with thatch over the top, that kind of thing. But you see when they're together, they're very closely monitored. But then, and they feel a little bit of safety in the number. But then when they come and they're drug away and they're isolated, that's when the real kind of torture comes to take place. And that's when you see like even the victim partnering almost in the war setting with the abuser, because they're afraid now, because they don't have the comfort of the group that they come from. And so how impactful that isolation part can be. I mean, that's what I see, and like, from the movies when I read a line like this. But let me throw a couple of lines out at you that are in this article.
Okay.
Once a person is away from long-standing emotional support, and thus reality checks, it is fairly easy to set a stage for brainwashing. Just that line right there says something to me. So longstanding emotional support, I have a phone conversation with my mom every day. My mom keeps me grounded. You know, maybe that's the scenario, right?
Yeah.
Now all of a sudden I'm not talking to my mom every day.
Mm-hmm.
So now I'm losing some of the emotional support that my mom is providing.
Mm-hmm.
That sets the stage. Now it's easier to brainwash you.
Yep.
Because you don't have your mom to come along and you say, you're not going to believe this thing that my abuser said to me last night. And your
Yeah.
mom's going to be like, well, that's ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
Reality check. When you don't
Mm-hmm.
have that, it's a lot easier for those messages to get inside of you and stay inside of you.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was an interesting thing to say.
And not only get inside of you and stay inside of you, you rationalize and make that okay or normal somehow, or yeah, all right, yeah, totally accepting
Exactly.
it. Mm-hmm. So
Because nobody comes along to question it but you. And your
exactly.
abuser's mission is to convince you that what's being said is truthful and accurate.
And in that way, that is one way that we do partner with the abuser to a degree, in that we allow that to become a part of our own psyche, our own concept of things.
But we also have to remember, because I'm still having a hard time with that concept, we also have to remember that this is coercion all day, every day, all
Mm-hmm.
day, every day. And even the strongest psyche will eventually get broken down with that.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm still having a hard time with that whole partnering thing.
I get it. I get it. That was one thing I had to do when I was in counseling after I was down there in Branson, was to talk about that with my psychologist, that I realized that I had part of the responsibility was on me for things that I did not stand up for.
I hope, though, you also discuss whether it was safe or not to stand up for them. I
I'm
mean,
sure
safety is paramount in a situation like that.
it is, and I'm sure we did. I
Okay.
can't tell you exactly that we did, but yeah, I mean, you can't just all of a sudden stand up to an abuser and expect to waltz out of the house.
Right.
If they're beginning to show power and control, it's getting dangerous.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. My advocate hackles keep getting riled up.
I'll bet they do. But you know, that's the same thing, like you gave the scenario of mom talking to mom on the phone every day. Same thing with working outside the home. That's why
Exactly.
he didn't want me, and I wanted to make sure I clarified that. That's why he didn't want me working outside the home, because then I would have that outside contact where people could say, no, he should never have said that to you, because that's not right.
Right.
Mhm.
Exactly. Abusive groups are not outward looking, but inward looking, insisting that members find all comfort and support and a replacement family within the group. Cut off from friends, family, relatives, previous relationships, abusive groups surround the recruits and hammer rigid ideologies into their consciousness, saturating their senses with specific doctrines and requirements of the group. That's a mouthful.
That is.
Abusive groups are not outward looking, but inward looking, insisting that all members find comfort and support and a replacement family within the group.
So they're replacing all of your mother's brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, etc., with the abusers.
Right. So once you're in this relationship, you don't look outside the relationship. Your pastor, your best friend, your coworkers. All that matters now is my new family, which is us in this relationship.
Yep.
And so then when that happens, same way in the prisoners of war camp, then you could start filling the person's mind with your doctrine and your requirements to succeed in the group. So this is the doctrine that you now adhere to, and these are the things that you do to survive if you're a prisoner of war.
Yeah.
In your home, now the doctrine is you do what I say, And that's the requirement of the group, that's your requirement for safety.
Yeah, exactly. And I can see just from the stories I've heard about the Nazis and how they would do that exactly to the groups of people.
Yeah. So here's another one. The seed of extremism exists whenever a group demands all the free time of a member, insisting every time the door is open, you're there. Every time you're called, you're available. Always being held into account. Same kind of thing. Like, again, we're talking, the things I'm reading, we're talking prisoners of war. But there's just such the overlap with victims of domestic violence. Like, just like you said, how was your time with the library today? You were 100% accountable all day, every day, whenever he decided you needed to answer the question or be available.
The other thing that comes to my mind is I am amazed as I think about it. I use the word freedom a little loosely, but with the freedom that he gave me at church. Although it wasn't total freedom, because I usually didn't drive by myself. I didn't drive separately, but there was also that hovering. He wasn't very far away. And it was very subtle how he made me aware of that. It was like I could never shake off that that annoying bug that was on my shoulder. He made sure that I knew that.
Because what if you said something or did something that he didn't approve of? So he needed to know what you were saying and what you were doing.
And who I was talking to and for how long.
Yeah. Once a prisoner stops interacting openly with others, the group's influence is all that matters. What does the statement mean anything to you? The process of isolation and self-doubt it creates allows the group and its leaders to gain power over the members. You're not talking to anybody else. You're only talking to your captors.
Yeah. Yeah. It's definitely, I don't know any other way to say it, but isolation, because he was my only adult conversation.
Right.
I do want to add something. I don't know if we've talked about it before, but we had some neighbors that lived across the street from us, and they had a little boy, she was in between the age of my two sons. And I never felt that I had the freedom to have that little boy over. I could not have put that into words. And she and I really clicked. And to this day, we call each other sisters, because she's just awesome. And she said, I had no idea what was going on over there, but I knew I could feel it. It was so different when he came home. Well, one day she came over. It was about the time I should have been starting supper. And she came and sat down, and I just loved her company. And our kids just got along so well. They might as well have been cousins. And I got more and more tense as I was thinking about the clock. What time does that clock say? And oh my goodness, it's getting closer and closer, and he's going to be here any minute. And what am I going to do? And trying not to go into a full-fledged panic, but yet still enjoy her company. I mean, I was just ripped in two. And sure enough, he came home before she and her son had left. And we talked about it, of course, years later after I had left him. And she said, I can remember that, because she said it totally changed the tone in the room, totally changed everything. And he wanted to make sure she knew she was not welcome to come over, just, casually come over and just visit for a while.
Exactly.
He was not going to allow that. And she was not going to stay for supper, because this was his home, his castle, his kingdom, and she was not going to intrude.
Yep, exactly. And everybody in the room can sense when things like that happen.
They can. So I had freedom to open the front door, but at the same time, I didn't have freedom to have friends over, if that
Right.
makes sense.
It makes complete sense. There was parameters on how far you could go with that.
Mm-hmm. Well, folks, we're not done yet. And so if you could make sure that you watch out for our next episode, make sure you subscribe, and that way you'll be notified when our next episode comes out. But we're going to get several episodes out of this. This is excellent. Becky, thank you for doing all this research and putting this together. This has been fantastic.
Thank you for your feedback as well. I appreciate your willingness to share parts of your story tonight. That was very helpful.
Absolutely. Absolutely. My life is pretty much an open book.
I've read it.
Remember that no matter where you are in this process, you're always free to soar.